Hey guys, and welcome to this week's video. This video is on severe acute respiratory syndrome related coronavirus 2, or as we like to know it, the virus that causes COVID-19. Now, symptoms of COVID-19 include a fever, so that's usually a temperature over 38 degrees, a continuous new cough, which is a bit fuzzy as to what it actually is, and most recently a loss of taste or smell. So here you'll see me drawing the virus. It's quite a large virus. It's about 50 to 200 nanometers in diameter, which is really small. Think that we can really only see down a microscope to about 5 microns. So you won't be able to see this under a microscope at all. So some important proteins to note that I'm labelling here is the spike protein, which is really important for the entry of this virus, and its genome is positive sense RNA. So how does this virus actually enter our body? So it spreads via coughing, sneezing and touch, and this is something called droplet infection. So this is when the virus is kept inside a liquid molecule and is spread via those liquid molecules. So the droplets are usually saliva. And the main entry point at which the virus enters our body is in the lungs, in a specific point in the lungs called the alveoli, which you'll see me just drawing here. Now, the alveoli are these little air sacs which inflate in the lung, and they allow us to breathe and obtain a lot more oxygen. They're often said to be, if you were to stretch them out, they'd fill the size of 2 football pitches, so they're really quite large on the inside. So if we go inside the alveoli, we'll see some very important features which are really useful to note. So here I'm just drawing one alveolus, and we have something called surfactant, which is a liquid that lines the alveoli, and the air space for the oxygen to enter, and 2 different types of cells. So the important type of cell to look at here is the type 2 cell. So this secretes the liquid surfactant, and without surfactant it's really difficult to breathe. I've just noted on there a couple of the key roles of surfactant. It's just really important for maintaining healthy and functioning alveoli. You will not be able to have healthy alveoli without surfactant. And what SARS-CoV-2 does is infect these type 2 cells. So how does it do this? So if we just take a side note a second and look at a generalised cell. So all cells have something called receptors on them, which are small proteins that recognise a signal, and then they induce a response in the cell. So your signal could be insulin, and the insulin receptor would induce uptake of glucose by the cell. So if we look in more detail at these type 2 alveoli cells, this might look like I'm going down really small in molecular terms, but it's really useful considering the virus is so small to just look at these tiny details. So you'll see the outside and the inside of the cell, and this purple sort of blob I've drawn is something called an ACE2 receptor, an angiotensin converting enzyme 2 receptor. Don't worry about the name, all it does is it's involved in systemic blood pressure. Then there's this protease, which is a cleaving enzyme, so it cuts things, which is also associated and near this receptor, especially in the lungs. And so it's also involved in this pathway. So how do these 2 proteins relate to these infections? So if we look at the entry of SARS-CoV-2, we will see that it binds first to ACE2. So I told you about these spike proteins earlier, these very bright pink proteins as I have drawn them. They bind to ACE2, and then that will induce this accompanying TMPRSS2 cleavage protease. It will cleave the inner portion of this receptor, but it also cleaves the spike proteins, the bright pink bit. And when it does that, this activates the receptor and the spike protein together and allows it to all be internalised. So the virus just entered via either something called endocytosis. So this is when the virus is stimulated to be taken up by the cell, or it enters by membrane fusion. So this is when it forces itself into the cell. Cells can be seen as being factories for viruses. So a virus will enter the cell and eventually all the proteins will dissociate and you will get a genome. So this is like your virus making manual. It has all the instructions to make a virus on it. And there's two routes this manual can take. The first route is to the first factory. I'm going to call them factories. They're very complex protein systems. Anyway, factory 1 can make more of these manuals. And then if it goes to the second factory, these can make the proteins which are required to make a virus. And then they're put together and this makes an actual virus particle itself. So the cell can also be seen to be an assembly line, whereby it churns out thousands and millions of these viruses in a matter of minutes. It's madness how fast the cell can make these, especially because they're normally forced to make these viruses. And so the virus then doesn't need to be in the cell any longer, so it exits it. It can either exit by something called exocytosis. So that's when it stimulates the cell to make it exit. So it's the opposite to what I talked about earlier called endocytosis, which is when you stimulate it to be taken up into the cell. But the most common way is it causes the cell to burst open and die via a process called apoptosis. So ACE2 is essential. It's necessary for the entry of SARS-CoV-2. They've shown that without ACE2, SARS-CoV-2 cannot actually enter any cell. And this other protease, it aids the entry and makes it easier to enter, but it's not always needed. So I'm just pointing out here all the different places in which ACE2 is found, and also another protein which is related to that process I talked about, endocytosis, which often helps the virus to take over the cell, and that's CTSL. That's just identified here by the different dots. This was just an interesting fact I thought I'd put in for you guys. So why does this make us ill? I mean, all the virus is doing is entering our bodies and then exiting it. Why is that going to make us unwell? Well, let's look at the symptoms of COVID-19 disease. So we have trouble breathing. Why is that so? That's because these type 2 cells, the ones which are most likely to be invaded by this virus, end up being destroyed by that process I talked about, apoptosis. Therefore, because type 2 cells make surfactant, there's no surfactant, so it's harder for the alveoli to inflate and for gas exchange to occur. Fever is another symptom, and this is due to our own immune system. So I'm not going to go into very much detail at all about this. Please let me know if you would like to know more about this. It's a very complex system, so I would need to create another video on it if that's what interests you guys. So the virus activates the immune system and stimulates something called an inflammatory response, and that releases small chemicals called cytokines, and that increases the core temperature of the body. So that's why your core temperature increases. It's as a response to an infection. The loss of smell or taste is not really well known, and it's probably due to the fact that the virus can infect the nasal cells, and so it's the same result as if you were infecting those type 2 cells. So these nasal cells are destroyed, and so no signal can be passed from the nose to the brain about a smell. So you're still receiving the smell, but it's not being travelling to your brain, so it's a loss of smell. And we know that taste as well is linked to smell, so that might have something to link with it as well. But we know that it's deadly. We know that COVID-19 is deadly and people have been dying from it. So yes and no, it is deadly. It's Deadly in the sense of, for some people they will survive it, they'll have minimal symptoms, but for others it can cause an overload of an immune response. And this will lead to something called septic shock. You've probably heard of sepsis, and that can be really deadly. Again, I will talk about that in a different video if it interests you. Also, destruction of too many of these type 2 cells can lead to less gas exchange and stimulation of a local immune response. So the virus activates a systemic immune response and a local immune response, so one at the site instead of the whole body. And this can cause viral pneumonia, which can then also lead to death through lack of oxygen. So let's get to the nitty gritty, guys. So why wasn't SARS-CoV-2 made by the Chinese? Why was it not man-made? So let's look at to why people think this. The first thing is the media. So on April the 16th, the US government set out a legislation to discover whether SARS-CoV-2 was made by the Chinese. And that sparked a lot of conspiracy theories to start off. It's really the starting point for where this came about was the distrust of China in America. Not only that, but also the fact that the main whistleblower, Dr. Li Wenliang, he died of suspicious circumstances from COVID-19. So this led to the conspiracy theory that he contracted it by being infected by the government for whistleblowing. Now, this is completely sceptical and highly likely not to be true. So let's have a look at China's viral history. So in 2003, really in 2002, we saw SARS, which was it's the virus that's related to SARS-CoV-2. China wanted to squash the outbreak. They told newspapers not to report. They told doctors not to diagnose it. They didn't want anything to do with this virus and they just wanted to cover it up. But they saw that the cost of covering it up led to fatalities and loss of trust from the globe. They lost their global standing. So when it came to the new one in 2019, SARS-CoV-2, they wanted to get the information out faster than the one in 2003. Obviously, this was pushed forward a lot by Dr. Wenliang, but it still meant that in early January, they got the genetic sequence shared globally. This is a big step for China. So let's look at the science to try and explain why COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 wasn't created by the Chinese. So first, this virus is quite large. To make a large virus, it's going to be quite expensive. So why not choose a smaller virus? That, to me, seemed like the first logical reason as to why this wasn't created by a government. Secondly, the genome. So the genome is the manual for making the virus itself. Very similar to coronaviruses seen in bats and pangolins. So you will have heard on the news that this probably came from a pangolin. Didn't know what a pangolin was before this. I now do know. And this is why they think it came from a pangolin. But if they were to have constructed this in a lab, they would have used a virus that already infects humans because it would be cheaper and faster. Again, another economic reason as to why this wasn't going to be a manufactured virus. But the main scientific reason is the receptor binding domain. So this is where that spike protein, that bright pink protein, binds to ACE2. This is the point at which it binds. So when they ran computer analysis on the receptor binding domain, it said that it would not bind very well to ACE2. It would be poor and there wouldn't be very good entry into the cell. However, in reality, this is not the case. This is one of the very few times where computer analysis can be wrong, and it actually bound so much better than any other construct seen before with SARS. And so they would have used the computer analysis to go forward and do experiments. They would have started at computer analysis first So why would they continue with or even make a virus with that construct if the computer said it was going to be a waste of time? So these 3 reasons I've highlighted is why science wins, and China did not create the coronavirus, guys. So I just wanted to thank you for watching this video. Thanks for waiting. Sorry it was slightly late. Just going to highlight a few conclusions from this video on this slide. The spike protein and how it requires ACE2 to infect, and that's mainly seen in the lungs. Apoptosis, I've just put it here just so you can see the spelling. And don't forget, it can enter other points, which is why they're like, don't touch your face when you touch a surface without wearing gloves. Anyway, so check out my other videos and please subscribe and hit like if you liked my video. Thanks, guys.